I'm going to start the recording as well. Second. I'm going to start the recording as well. Second. All right, everybody, welcome. We're so happy to have you here. Today, we are walking through the third of our webinar series on DataStage. Excited to have Gabe Green. And really, I am not the star of the show, so I hope that you guys enjoy. And Gabe, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
All right, sounds good. So today, what we're doing is walking through the third in our three-part series of DataStage. So that means I get to have a little fun and go through some advanced tips and tricks. So we won't cover too much inside Cloud Pak for Data, which we did before. And we won't cover too much of the fundamentals. I'll assume that you already know those. So this is really for people that are already using the product, familiar with the core, which is going to be Watson pipelines, and we're going to leverage some features and capabilities within, including Watson Studio, to enhance some of what we can do with DataStage and the data integration flows that you might develop, and then DataStage flows themselves. So, not a whole lot of time to cover a lot of advanced material. So we'll see what we can do. All right, let me share my screen. There we are. So what we're going to do, and this is an example of, and I'll show you this later, right? So this is a Python notebook or Python script, rather, that we're going to use later. And this is one example that'll show you of an advanced tip or trick. But what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to show you, previously I was showing you DataStage, but DataStage running through Cloud Pak for Data as not as a service, but software. And that software was technically running on IBM Cloud. However, it was a software version. And the software version has some sections where you can leverage the same storage and things like that. And it's file-based storage that's running in an OpenShift containerized environment. So there are some things that you can do inherently with that you can't do if you're talking about using DataStage as a service. There are some differences when you use an anywhere engine, which is a feature that you can use in the as a service, where the orchestration or the cloud services technically run in IBM Cloud as managed services. And then you control provisioning using something like Docker on your own virtualized server running in your favorite cloud provider, and it communicates only information about orchestrating, did execute this flow, did the flow execute, and things like that. But so what you're seeing here is since I'm running this strictly in IBM Cloud as a managed service, and I'm going to use the DataStage engine that runs in IBM Cloud as well. You're seeing I have technically in my cloud account, I have Watson Studio. I have a few others, but we're going to use Watson Studio. Automatically, you do have to tie it to Cloud Object Storage, right? So IBM COS, and I'll show you what that looks like. And then we're going to use the DataStage service. And so I've opened some of these, right? So here's DataStage and Cloud Pak for Data running as a managed service. You can see I get a launch IBM Cloud Pak for Data. But I also have the Cloud Object Storage open. And when I have this open, you'll see I've got lots of buckets here. And I'll show you sort of how we're going to line those up, right? And for the most part, when you set this up the way that I'm going to show you with some of the tips and tricks, you almost don't need to know this. But I'll show you, give you an example of how things look when they're provisioned behind the scenes. But I'm going to launch Cloud Pak for Data. Right, and when I do, I'm in, and we kind of saw this in the other sessions, but you're familiar with this already, right? Since you already are familiar with DataStage. And I've got a couple of projects here, and I'm going to show you a couple of things. right? One is when you provision DataStage as a managed service, and I pardon me, open this project, the projects are all backed by files on cloud object storage. Now, where you can find that is if you go to the manage section, depending on your permission within the project, if you go to the manage section and you go to general, you can see here's the bucket, right? And you can say manage an IBM cloud, assuming you have permission to get to it, then you can get to it. You have a means to do certain things like access control, and I can create access tokens that allow me to leverage things inside the project itself. Or you can do things like get to the bucket credentials and other information, although there's an easier way to do that if you're using DataStage. I think easier. Anyway, so you can see this is example COS file processing, do not delete, blah, 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 and some, unique identifier at the end. And in my cloud object storage, right, for my account, I can see that example COS file processing, do not delete, right? PR 3D such and such, 3D blah, 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 GNU, 3D blah, 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 GNU is here, right? So, okay, here's where it is. When you go into the cloud object storage, you'll see prefixes, but you can represent them as folders, right? And so this organizes more like a folder view in Windows Explorer, right? And so now I can go in and I can see DataStage, I can see artifacts and so on, right? Notebooks and other metadata that it handles for me. Technically, I don't really need to go into here. Where you might want to do that is if you're exchanging file information between services, right? And so that comes up all the time. You had the old DataStage, you might be familiar with it, right? Had what was called sequence jobs. And those sequence jobs would do things like interrogate files you had in a given location, right? And so for each one of the files in a certain location, I want to run a DataStage flow, pass in the file name as a parameter and execute similar logic. Or do other things, run a DataStage flow, and DataStage flow pulls records out and puts that into a text file that maybe I interrogate with something else in a sequence job or something. All right, so if I click on assets here, you'll see a couple of things, right? I have a few different notebooks. I'm going to unlock that one. And here's an example of potentially where I want to go in and I want to do some, I'm going to connect to an FTP server. I'm going to do some navigation in the FTP server, and I'm going to grab an archive zip file, right? And so this occurs all the time. This is something that you might need to do. And I'm going to grab that zip file in one notebook. If it exists, right, I'm going to move it into a location in cloud object storage, and then I'm going to unzip it. And then I'm going to do a data stage process of the files within certain files. And then I'm going to move that or back it up somewhere, right? So that, if you're not aware, right, that involves several different services and in different tips and tricks that we'll show you here. But so what I have is whenever you run DataStage, right? So if you don't see this project underscore COS connection, you will, as soon as I say new asset DataStage flow. All right, so as soon as you go into a DataStage flow, like if I go into my process file, as an example, as soon as I open it and use a sequential file stage, if I double click this sequential file stage and I go to output and I go to properties, right? The file location is file system, specific files. And if I click browse, what you'll notice is you have an option to navigate through sections of what technically you can see on the back end, right? So if I go project COS connection, no assets found. But here's the example, right? Project COS connection is that data connection that you saw. So if it doesn't exist at this point, it will create it. Right, and so now it's looking for specific files in a specific location. Technically, That's the name of the bucket itself, right? So, and I can organize and so on, but I don't really care about that. If I didn't have Project COS connection, now I'll have it, right? And so what is that? Why does that matter? Well, that if I want to use later to sort of flexibly connect outside of DataStage to my backend bucket so that I can use services like notebooks to now read and write to that same file system and access those same files. Now I don't need to worry so much about credentials, right? So now if I look at the Project COS connection, which is going to be named the same thing even if I go between environments, right? Project COS connection will be there. And if I delete it and open a flow again, it'll be recreated, right? And then if I scroll down, you'll see, look, here's that bucket for the project. It filled it in for me automatically. It filled in an endpoint. And in fact, it has, they're obfuscated, but it has API key, access key, secret key, and so on. Everything I would need to connect to cloud object storage via something like Python. All right. So then what I do, right? So now we have a DataStage flow that will, in this example, all it's going to do, and you can see this annotation, right? So this is in the documentation, but it's a little tricky to sort of figure out the style. But in the documentation, right, what this means is I'm going to use cloud object storage. So whatever the bucket is defined for the project, and here's the prefixed path. So I'm going to use a file that's going to be in an uploaded prefix, UAT in this case, stage, and then it's going to be called sample underscore data CSV. So if I look at my bucket here, here's uploaded. Now that didn't exist before. That's my custom folder. And I'll show you how that was created. But if I go to uploaded, right, that's what it looks like. Here's UAT. I've got a backup in a stage folder, and I'm controlling those, right? And so here's my unzipped file with a sample CSV, right? So now this will run, and I can expect that file will be there provided my process completes. Okay. And then I'm not doing anything with it. This is just as an example. So now we'll go back and we'll say, okay, great, but how are we going to orchestrate this? And I've got a pipeline, right? So this is what I'm building to sort of control the flow. And this is what you would have to control more complex logic. But okay, I want to connect to an FTP server and I want to do some navigation in some logic. Well, that's if I can't script out some FTP syntax to navigate through the folders in some logic within, that's difficult to do in just the FTP stage of DataStage. So no problem, right? If I need more advanced logic, I'll go out into a notebook. So this is called, it's in the same project, but get from FTP. And I'm passing in some environment variables. And so here's one tip and trick as well. What do I do with these? All right, so I'm going to pass in some stuff like an access token. Well, that's my access token that you saw in the manage access section of the project itself. This will allow me to manipulate things within the project. And here's the execution environment. And the pardon me, execution environment is set right now to UAT, right? And these are parameters that I have here in the global objects that I set at the pipeline level, but they could be set from parameter sets or something like that, right? But I could modify it here and then rerun, and I'd have a different context. All right, so now those are passed in as environment variables. So now we'll go to my get from FTP notebook, and we'll take a look at that. Now keep in mind, I've uploaded already, right? So see this IBM COS functions Python. Now you can upload inside a project. You can upload files that technically aren't something that you could normally read or manipulate within the context of the managed service. It just stores them. So I could load images, things like that. What I do with them, don't know. In this case, I've got this sitting here inside the project. So now it's in the context of the project. And I could load it in the same project or a different project if I wanted to have a central project that contained a lot of my common functions. Now that COS project, the IBM Cloud Object Storage Connectivity Python is largely from just a support article that IBM had with some slight modifications. But you can see I'm importing, and I'm going to use IBM's version of the Bado 3 Python library here, or the package, and IBM S3 transfer, and a few other things. I am going to use their access project or space from the Watson Studio Lib. So then how do I connect and context here? And so I have an init default. Optionally, I can pass in a token. And then I could also pass in a different project ID if I wanted to store this in a different project and connect back to the bucket of another project. Right. And so if I don't have a Watson Studio Lib, I do a few things, and this could vary to the favorite way you like to connect. But effectively, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage that connection, which I know will be there by name. As long as I'm running DataStage and I've initially hit the sequential file to browse, it'll create one for me, and it'll have all the information I need to connect to the cloud object storage that's backing the project. Right. I'll pass in, so I can grab from COS creds, right, certain information like the associated bucket. I can fill in some of this, right? Here's how you would connect using the Bado 3 client and the associated information from the project COS connection, right? So at that point, I don't need to store anything specifically. And then I'm going to do a few other things like, create a holder so that I can just, put this back and return it back so that I can leverage it outside. Well, that's great. So now I have common Python functions, but how do I use them? Right. So now if I go back and I'm looking here at my main Python library, and so I have this, right, and we haven't opened it yet, but I go into here and I go into my Git FTP notebook. There we go. Right, and here's what I do. So for one, you saw that I was passing information, the execution environment and the access token. Right, and so here's how you would access those, right? And so they become just environment variables. So if I do the standard Python, get env, I can count on those being there if I pass them in. Otherwise, there'll be none. So I can set defaults, or I can optionally go, oops, if it's not provided, I better throw an error. Right. But you can see I passed in UAT and it read it. Now I'll do the Watson Studio import lib, right? And I've got the Watson Studio lib here, but this import lib is what I use. So I connect to the Watson Studio library using the token. That'll connect to this project because that's where I'm storing my Python functions, my common functions. But I could connect to a different project if I wanted to. I just would need the appropriate access token to access the assets within that project. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to download. So here you can see I'm downloading using the Watson Studio library functions. I'm downloading that Python library that represents my common functions. Right? And then I'm going to import those common functions by name. And I'm going to use import lib and reload, which effectively, in context of the executing notebook, now loads runs that Python script. And so I get the functions defined. And away I go, right? So now I have the by name. I left that name, right? So I'm using my IBM COS functions, and here's that init default. So I pass in the access token. And then at the end of it, right, so this will connect to my backing bucket for the given project. Right, and then I'll add the uploaded in the context of my execution environment, which is uploaded /UAT. And you can see, I'm logging some information, so I'm connected successfully to the bucket. Now I'm going to import, and you could use different libraries, and I'll show you how that's done, right? So I didn't do a pip install. You can create your own custom notebook environments, right? So if I go to the execution environments or the engines that are associated with this project, I'll show you that. But then I'm going to connect to this FTP server. And now I can do custom logic, right? So now I'm in Python, so I can do whatever I want. And so I'm going to list things out. I'm going to get a connection, right? And this is how you would get a connection. But I also had that in my common functions. And then I'm going to do things like, connect to using the Paramiko library here. I'm going to connect and I'm going to then navigate, use the SSH client and the FTP client, and I'm going to do some things to determine, okay, do I have that file? And if I do, and it matches the given pattern, download it. And this is an archive file, right? And so all this is going to do is it's going to say, so here's now my Cloud Object Storage client. And so now I'm going to use the functions that I have within, and I'm going to say, okay, if that already exists in the stage area, the archive file already exists, then I'm going to go ahead and delete that archive file. And then I'm going to upload the new one, right? So in the case this failed and the archive file is still sitting out there, I don't want this to fail. I want to make sure it's the brand new. So I'm going to delete it first, then I'm going to upload. Close the connection, right? And then at the end, what I do is this, right? And so why do I do this? Again, this is another tip or trick, right? So you see this line. Well, and if I can count on that line being in the log of the notebook. So now when I run this notebook, I'm going to get this line in one of the cell outputs, or I'm not, right? So if I don't have any matching files, if I didn't have any zip files that are sitting out there, right, in my Cloud Object Storage, because I'm connecting to Cloud Object Storage here, right, and I'm grabbing Cloud Object Storage, and then I'm navigating the items with a given prefix. So now I can see, are there zip files out there that were sitting out there that were never processed? Right, and this might be if I have files that are pending in a stage location or a to be processed location, and they need to be processed. And now I'm rerunning the overall pipeline, right? And I want to design the pipeline so it just sort of seamlessly continues and processes what it didn't process last time. So this line, I can count on this line, right? And why is that important? Well, we'll see, right? So, okay. So now what I'm going to do is, for one, I'll show you, we'll go back here and I'll show you this, right? If I go to manage and I go to environments, templates, and I have a custom template, right? And so I have a couple of them, but here's my runtime 24/1 extra small, right? In the context of the Cloud Object Storage, right? And if I click on that, right, it says custom. Well, why is it custom? If I say edit, you have a means, IBM provides a means to create a customization, and the customization can do things like install. And so now I don't have to worry about doing specialized, pip installs and things like that live in the first cell of my notebook to make sure I have, you know, uh, packages that I typically use, right? And I want to make sure they're there for developers to use without them remembering to do the installs. And there are lots of ways you can get that done, but this is one way. And so I'm making sure I have Paramiko installed in this one. So that's how I was doing that. So, right, that said, if I go back to my process all files, so I've run this notebook. And in theory, if I have archive files sitting out my cloud object storage, right, which I don't, you can see the stage doesn't have them, but they would be sitting in my uploaded UAT environment here. And if I had them, then I would get this line, right? Last line in the notebook. Okay. Now, if I go back to my process files, so the pipelines, if you're familiar with them, you can do things like loop in sequence. And there's a loop in parallel too, but if I loop in sequence, you have a means to drive the looping context. And I can do things like you loop in a standard for like a this many times 1 to 10, or I can iterate through items. And so if I say text is the input type, you can say, okay, and grab something that produces text. And so you can see I'm using my get file list, which is my bash script, and its standard output, and it's pipe delimited, right? And so now I can control, am I going to loop and execute my data stage job or not? Do I have something sitting out there to process or do I not? Right? And so, here I've got zip files, but, I need to unzip one at a time and run my data stage process. So now if I look at my bash script, inside, right, I have two environment variables again. And the way these are defined is that's my get from FTP, which is my notebook job. And that's the job, right? And then this is my get from FTP job run. And with those two, with the job and the job run, that gives you the context of retrieving the logs for a notebook. And within pipelines, you have a command line. You have several things there. One of them that IBM places out there is what's called CPD CTL or CPD cuddle, depending on how you want to say that. But um, and so what I'm doing is in the context of the environment variables, I have my job ID and my run ID, which represented my previous, my current, the stage that was just prior to this executed in the same pipeline. It represents the notebook run. And CPD CTL will take, I can do job run logs, and that retrieves the job that ran, which is executing a notebook technically, but it retrieves the job logs. And so based on the job ID and the run ID. And then I'm putting them in a location in the context of this bash script. So it's going to retrieve the execution and it's going to say, okay, great. So now I have this file. And if I have the file, if that ran successfully and I actually do have logs, I'm just doing a standard grep, and see what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, look for any output, and I'll get the cell output in the job logs. So look for any output, and just from a regex pattern standpoint, it has to start with file-list : That's pretty unique, and it's only going to be in one place if I have zip files, which will be here, right? So I'm printing this if I have files, right? Or it'll just say file-list : and have nothing after it. And so that allows me to now use the output of a notebook that I'm controlling to decide what to do next or what pieces to grab, right? So now I'm grabbing it, and so it'll get the list from the bucket of zip files that are sitting out there. And I might have just placed another out there, no big deal, right? So I have the previous ones that were sitting out there and haven't been moved, and I've got any new ones, right? And so now I grab the file list, and what I do is I grab the second field, which is my pipe delimited list of zip files that are sitting out there waiting to be processed. And I echo that in the standard output, just making sure that I don't have anything funny after it. No special tabs, line feeds, carriage returns, anything like that. Or, I just say, okay, look, I don't have anything, right? No log for that job or something like that. But otherwise, provided I have the job log, yeah, I might have nothing returned because I have no zip file sitting out there. No big deal. Right. And so then this pipeline completes and doesn't return an error, just it's got nothing to process. And so I could schedule this to repeat periodically. And if I've got nothing, no big deal. But otherwise, the standard output will contain the pipe delimited list of zip files. And then this is set to use each zip file by name. Right. And so now what I can do is I've got the zip file by name is the item in the context of this loop. So if I look at my unzip and I scroll down, I'm setting now the zip file. And you saw before the execution environment access token, but now I have the zip file And that's my sequence name, loop for files item, which just represents the zip file name. Right? So what's going to happen is it's going to say, okay, the first one is this sample data, blah, blah, blah. Right? So it's on this item for the first loop. Right? And so now it runs unzip file. And so again, this is something you might have done inside a sequence job in DataStage. And so unzip file. All right, so I just import the same. I've got the same cell at the beginning to read the execution environment. And you can see zip file is one of them, right? And that's required because I have to know what zip file to process. And here you can see, here's my zip file, and that's my execution environment. I import and connect to the bucket backing this project again. And so now what I can do is I can say, okay, navigate the objects that are in my uploaded folder inside the backing bucket uploaded folder in UAT. And so it's going to look for any of the files there. And then it just has to match my regex pattern, which is anything and then some sort of a date. CSV is my file pattern, but I'll match the zip files. And then basically, or I guess in this first one, what I'm doing is deleting anything in state. So it would delete that CSV file you saw. So I'm matching any CSV file. And then I'm taking the zip file. And so here you go. Here's the zip file pattern. Right. And now I'm navigating. I'm just using, zip file, which is just something I could access in Python. Again, very easy to do. And just saying extract it, and it's going to extract it locally into the context of this notebook environment, right? So it's extracting into a location and created a stage folder and effectively moved the zip file and then said, okay, unzip the zip file. And then I'm going to navigate that stage folder and I'm looking for any of those CSV files. Provided I have a match, then what it's going to do is it's now going to upload that. It's going to upload that into to use an upload file of my cloud object storage function. It's going to upload it. And you can see, here's my message. So it went into the prefix uploaded UAT stage sample data CSV. And so I have it removing the specific timestamp so that I can execute the data stage flow without caring what the name is specifically. Right, and then I execute my data stage flow, counting on that file being there for the given day, right? So this could be something a vendor supplies to you. And then it puts it in the bucket, right? Cleared everything out of stage, and now stage has the file or files that were in my zip file that I want to process. And if I go back, that completes the unzip portion, right? And now I process the data stage file, and I don't have to pass anything in except for my execution environment. And here you can see I'm doing the context of my execution environment parameters, and I'm just making sure that I make it lowercase. Right, it runs data stage. Then finally, I back up the file. And so now I'm backing up that specific zip file, and I want to move it out of this location because I know it's been processed. Right, and so execution environment, zip file, and token. And my backup file notebook is in a similar context. So I'm pulling the environment variables so that I can use them inside this notebook. I'm, in this case, connecting to connecting in a different way. I think I did it this way as an example, showing how I could pull some credentials from JSON. And forgive the error here, I guess. I was playing with some things here prior to the webinar, and that's how that goes. But then effectively what I'm doing is I'm going to connect again And then I think here I'm backing up on, so this was connecting and moving things, which on the FTP, right? So that zip file was on the FTP side. And what I want to do is move it because I don't want to retrieve it later from the same FTP server. So it was a way to go, okay, now connect to FTP, move that file to a certain location. And then here, what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, look, now you're going to go into the backup location. If that exact same file is there, remove it, right? But then otherwise move it. And that's it, right? So it's an example of something you would typically do. And there are some additional complexities in the context of the managed service that's all running in the cloud environment. But this is an example of how you could do that communication and the flexibility that you have when you involve the various services, which you can do using IBM Cloud and DataStage running as a managed service. So I know we're over time, and this is a long webinar, but I will show you quickly here one additional example, which is if you're familiar with parameter sets, how can you pass encrypted parameters right between the services? So we saw a way that now I could leverage the backend cloud object storage to my advantage, right? And use it to do things like, hold files that I might leverage in other services between DataStage, shell scripts, and so on, right? Just using either DataStage and or Python inside the context of Watson Studio notebooks to manipulate files, right? And so here's an example. If I want to use parameter sets, and we'll go fast because I know we're over time. But if I want to use parameter sets, how can I pass encrypted parameters, right? Or what's one way to do it? And there are I'm sure other ways you could do that too. Individual parameters you could pass, right? So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to look at configurations, right? And here's a parameter set, right? And so I'll open that parameter set, new tab, right? And here's a representation of the parameter set. And so I've encrypted username, password, and database, right? I don't want people seeing those, but I want to use them. Well, in the context of DataStage, no big deal, right? DataStage automatically finds when you pass in a leverage a parameter set, right? So if I click on my DataStage flow, if I leverage an encrypted parameter, it automatically says, okay, that's encrypted. And in the context of this data stage flow, it unencrypts, right? But it's short-lived. You don't get access to it in any way. So what I've done is I said, okay, I'm going to generically create a parameter of the string type. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in and I'm going to loop through username, password, and so on, right? And whether it's encrypted or it's not, doesn't matter, right? So in the context of data stage, it'll see the encrypted value and it will decrypt it inside the flow context, or it'll leave it as is inside the flow context, right? So data stage is one way that I could then decide what I want to do with it later if I want to leverage it in other services. But now I can maintain them inside the parameter set and I could run something periodically that now re-encrypts and leverages in a way that I could access elsewhere if I wanted. And so what I'm going to do is, right, so now I've got no parameter set assigned here. I only have a local parameter. And there's a data stage function. And in order for this just to make sure this works correctly, what I've done is you'll see none of this has any flow markings indicating what I'm doing is everything's running in a not parallel mode, but sequential mode. And so you can see I've set everything to sequential. I'm using a row generator to facilitate just one row, right? So you can see I've just got one row. Doesn't matter what it is. Technically, what I want is transformer. But transform is not a source or a target. It's only a transformation, right? So data moves in between. Inside transformer, what I'm going to do is, sure, I've got the input that was developed by the row generator, but I don't care. It's one row. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that one row and I'm going to change it, or I'm going to leave it, right? So this executes a function. Technically, the function returns a 1 or 0, depending on if it worked or didn't work. So it really, the value doesn't matter so much. Provided it works, you're good. But set user status, and then I'm using the parameter, the local parameter that was provided to the flow. So if that was an encrypted parameter, like if I passed in the password, the flow, DataStage flow, when it runs, it automatically decrypts that value. Set user status sets a special string registry for the flow output that you read at the end of the flow execution. And you read that from a pipeline. So doesn't matter really what I pass into it, right? That's just going to set a special registry. And I'll show you where you can access that. Right. And inside, I just made the context here sequential as well. Right. Whatever is the last value setting that is the one that sets the user status value. Right. So I want to make sure I'm controlling that specifically. And then the peak is just here because I have to have an output for transformer. But that's it. So the logs really don't give you much of anything. I'll see in my peak stage that I have a value of 1, which just means, hey, your set user status ran successfully. It says something. Okay. So that's fine, right? So now if I go back to my project, what am I going to do with that? Well, I've got a pipeline. And you can do this a variety of ways. This was just kind of an example I wanted to show of I'm going to loop through the values in this parameter set. So I've got 5 rows, and I want to loop through all 5 and store them in a way that I can access later in another service like Watson Studio Notebooks. But I want to be able to retrieve the encrypted values. And you don't have the ability to do that in the managed service side. Within a notebook, I don't have the ability to retrieve the unencrypted values outside of DataStage. So what I'm doing here is I go into my pipeline. And here I'm leveraging some functions. So first thing, no pipeline parameters. However, here's my parameter set. What are the values? I don't know, right? Aside from these two. So, okay, then I have a loop and sequence. So the bash script is the first thing I call. And again, I can do things like pass, and you'll see here's the magic here as I say, I've got a parameter I'm going to pass in as an environment variable. And if I look at the value, I'm leveraging inside pipelines has the ability to execute certain functions. One of those is param underscore sets, and then you give it it'll enumerate for you. It's got a code completion, but it'll enumerate for you. Then the parameter set by name. And what that represents is when I first do it, it will give me all of the keys. So I get a JSON return, which has all of the keys. So that'll be JSON that's returned with all of the key names. And then what I'm doing is in the context of a bash, IBM includes things like CPD, CTL, and also JQ. JQ is a great way to interrogate JSON and pull things out, and quite powerful. So I'm just pulling out the keys in the JSON, right? The values will indicate that they're encrypted, right? So it doesn't really help me much having the blurb of JSON at this point. All I care about are the keys, and so then I'm just reorganizing the keys instead of a carriage return or a line feed that's after each. What I'm going to do is pipe delimit, and then I'm removing the last pipe, and that's all. So now I can loop in sequence, right? So now I loop in sequence, Same way. I get the standard output of my previous stage and it's pipe delimited. So provided I have keys, it's going to loop for each one of the keys. So 5 times. So then what I'm doing is executing my data stage flow, and technically I've got my parameter key. So how do I pass that in? Well, again, pipelines make that easy. So I've got that local parameter, which was p param inside my data stage flow that you saw. If I edit my parameters, if I have the key name, which I do in my sequential loop item, right? So this is inside the context of the pipeline's functional syntax, right? The expression syntax. This is how I can say, okay, in the parameter, then give me the value associated with the following key. And I know each iteration of the loop is a key. So the first time it's going to be username. So it'll give me the encrypted value, which won't be readable to me. No problem. Right, just passing that in is my local parameter for the data stage flow. Now data stage will execute and it's going to decrypt it automatically. And then I'm using a set user status to set that registry. Now I'm using a bash script as the next stage. And you can see I've got my parameter value. So most of these are loop, right? So I've got my counter. I've got my name, which is the key, right? In that case, username in the iteration will be the first iteration. And then I've got a glob of JSON, right? So I've created a local variable for the pipeline, and I didn't show you that, but I can show you that, which then I'm going to modify the value with the set user status variables. So initially, there's nothing there, right? Just an empty string, and I'll show you how I'm setting that. But now I've got the value, and the value set by the user status. All right, so I won't save this here, but if I said, okay, just as an example, right? I'm going to say choose the type, and it's a string. And I'm going to say grab it from another node. And then now I can see that my data stage job is here. That's a previous stage. And the output, and guess what? I have user status. Right. And so after the job executes, the user status will be what I set it to using that transformer function set user status. Right. And so now inside my bash script, not much to it. Right. I know that, okay, look, if this is the first execution, then I'm going to just, make this look like JSON. And I'm not really using any advanced tricks here to create the JSON. I'm sort of brute forcing some of it as an example. But now I'm going to add the parameter using JQ as JSON. And now I've got, if it was already decrypted, then I've got the same value. If it wasn't, like in the case of username or password, the encrypted values inside my parameter set, it's at this point decrypted. And I'm storing those into, right? So I'm keeping track of this JSON inside a file local to the context of my bash script. And then I'm taking it and I'm outputting now the blurb of JSON string as a string in the standard output of my bash script. So now I'm using set user status. Right? And I'm setting the new value of this variable to the standard output of my bash script, right? So effectively what I'm doing is the first time this runs, it'll create a brand new JSON string and put the first value in there, which will be username. And then the value, it'll be username in JSON, colon, and then in the value, it'll be the decrypted version of this value inside the parameter set. Okay. Right, so now at the end, I'll have the full set of all 5 values, but it could be, I could modify my parameter set, rerun this, and it would pick it up. And so now at the end of this, right, so now it's done. And what I'm doing is then storing the values. Right, and so different ways you can do this. but what I'm doing is I'm going to pass in the variable, which is now my string of the full JSON with decrypted values. But it's only live in the context of this. So, what am I doing with this? I'll show you. And this is my parameter set name, right? Which right now I have as literal. You could do it several ways. Now, if I look back at my global object, you'll see I do have, here's my user variable. And at the beginning, it's nothing. Okay, so then my store values is a notebook. And you could decide to store this in different ways, but this is how I did it. Right, so I'm using the context, and I could use my cloud object storage functions again. But what I'm doing is inside the context here, I'm passing in, if we look at my pipeline, these were the environment variables. So really, it's parameter set name and the parameter set JSON with decrypted values. And so, I have to have the parameter set name, and I have to have the JSON in, and all I'm doing is just kind of doing a quick check, right? So it has to be supplied. And then also I'm using a Python function, just load it, and which will also give me if it didn't actually validate JSON. All right, so anyway, so now I've got the JSON that I know is JSON and then can access easily, right? And then now what I'm doing is I'm using the Watson Studio library, connecting to the given project. I'm loading my cloud object storage functions here. So I am using those. Connected to the bucket. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking my parameter set name, so ps underscore test, and I'm going to make a JSON file. And at first, what I'm doing is I'm doing this local, right, in the temp folder, right? So I'm just creating that JSON file, and this is decrypted values. Then I'm going to create a version of it with a .enc. And as long as you control it, and you could do your own functions or something, you just have to make sure it's in the context. You've created the Python functions that you can replicate or duplicate in other services where you want to use this. But in my case, I'm using OpenSSL, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an AES 256 with a passcode, a passphrase, to encrypt. And so that I can control the passphrase, and that passphrase can be in the context. That could be the run ID associated with your pipeline, right? So you could re-encrypt this associated with your pipeline, and then it would only be really viable inside the context of things that understood or could use that same run ID GUID. Or if you want to just run this periodically and store the values and then retrieve them later, so you have an updated but your own version of these encrypted values somewhere that you could leverage, you could do that too. Just have to keep track of the passphrase. Right, and now I'm using the cloud object storage, and what I'm doing is saving the encrypted values. And so in this case, right, the bucket that's backing this is example parameters of processing do not delete 21W4. Example parameter set 21W4. Right, and here's my encrypted values. So if I were to download those, right, that's fine. Now if I open that and attempted to look at that inside something, right, that's what that looks like. So I can't read them. Even if someone could access your cloud object storage, then, like another developer or something like that, they wouldn't know what to do with it unless they specifically knew the passphrase and how you were encrypting it, right? But, okay, so now I go back and we'll look at the assets. And so now, great, I've done that, but now what do I do? How do I use it? So now if I look at my notebook testing, or I could have other services, technically in other projects, right, that as long as I can leverage using a token, the same bucket to grab this encrypted version, right? So I'm physically setting the passphrase here. You wouldn't do that normally, right? And again, this could be in the context of a given pipeline execution if you just wanted to store it temporarily. I've given it the parameter set name. Now I'm going to download, right? Same cloud object storage connecting to the bucket. Now I'm going to download my parameter set encrypted version. It's going to store it in the context of, this kernel running the notebook, but I know how it was encrypted and I know the passphrase. And so this will decrypt it, right? It's going to store it back as my unencrypted version, right? And then I reload it. And so there's my unencrypted version. And so now I can say, great, I'll do a check, right? And then if I print the values, I can print the values and they would be the unencrypted versions, right? And so if I run this, and I'm not for sure that it's, haven't tried this in a while, so we'll see if my access tokens and so on are good. But if I run this, right, then you should see the unencrypted version of those values. And then that'll be it, and that'll bring us to the top of the hour here. Right, but there you go. And so let me see, right? And so you can see this is hiding the cell, from review, right? So if you were to share this is a way you can hide the cell from the output, but loaded the values, right? So here's my connecting to the bucket. Let's see if this works. Okay, worked, good. We saw the file was out there, right? So there you go, grab the file and decrypted it. Now I'll print it. And there you go, right? So here's my database, my password, right? Username, and so on, right? So there you go. Now I could do whatever with this, right? And continue to use it, right? So I could just go, okay, I care about my database here in the context of, Python. So there you go. In whatever, right? Continue and use that same parameter set, modify the parameter set as long as I made sure that it was refreshed, right? My encrypted version would reflect the latest values of my parameter set. And so now I can kind of synchronize those two and leverage them wherever. So anyway, that brings us to the top of the hour, and I'll stop sharing. And Joy, I don't know if you're there, but I think I'm done.
I'm here, Gabe. Thank you so much. All right. Well, really, like I said, I'm just here for the welcome and the thank yous. So shout out to Gabe. Thank you for presenting. And Gabe, is there anything else before we close?
Well, I don't think so. If there's any, if anyone has any questions, I'm sure they have a way to respond or get to us. Happy to help.
Very
Different
good.
examples you want to see, if I can help, let me know.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gabe.